good.
All right, so what I'm going to talk about is a little out of place in the setting because I'm talking about Troicka Ploshad, or Trinity Square, sort of as it started at the beginning of the 1700s. It was sort of stretching throughout the general area, so I'm just going to give you a breakdown of sort of what it might have looked like as it was growing at the beginning of the city. It was one of the first places and that was really developed. It was on the spot of a pre-existing settlement, which was chosen because it was in an advantageous position. It was right on the water, which was important they needed a port for construction as well as for military purposes. The area got its name from the old Trinity Cathedral. Which supposedly the foundations for the cathedral were laid at the same time as the foundations for the Peter and Paul Fortress, which was May 1st, 1703. This is also the same day that the capital apparently officially switched from Moscow to St. Petersburg. So the port sort of functioned as sort of a catch-all, people coming in, people going out. Opposite the port on the north side, sort of developed a more commercial area. Gostinny Dvor developed. It was, at that point, it was very haphazard. It was wooden stalls. It was just sort of came about to meet the needs of the people at the time. They sold food and goods and whatever really was necessary. In the center, they built the first stock exchange in 1705. And this is interesting because at the time there were only 4 others in Europe. There was one in Holland, there was one in London, and there were 2 in France, but this was still very much a new thing. And in a lot of ways it sort of helped to set the tone of what Peter was trying to build, because in the middle of what was generally just a place that was developing as people needed it, he was sort of this driving force in trying to create something that was not just catching up with the European cities, but very much on the edge and on the cusp of what was new. The Gostinny Dvor burned down in 1710 and was rebuilt in 1713. This was a little bit more regulated. It was state-owned, but it was built surrounding the stock exchange. On the west side were the colleges, or was the college. It was Dutch Baroque style, which is the same as the cathedral, and it was built in a very standard, simple style because the intention was that they could then duplicate it as they needed to expand. This is obviously not done here, but the same idea was carried over when they built the 12 colleges on Vasilyevsky Island. The college actually did house the Senate for a short period of time, from 1718 to 1723. On the east side, there was Krasny Bridge, which connected the fortress and the square. There was also the city's first printing shop, which was moved there in 1713. And again, there was the first bookshop was also opened in Trinity. And this was sort of a part of Peter's push for literacy, which was one of sort of his big sort of motivations, and again, part of him trying to modernize. Also on the east side was the Astoria Four Frigates Tavern, which was an interesting place because it served as a major point of socialization on the square. It really catered to all sorts of people. There were soldiers, there were laborers, there was nobility coming in. Peter himself would come in. Interestingly, I read this, apparently Peter's favorite drink was vodka with cayenne pepper, because vodka itself just wasn't rough enough. He just needed that, so fun fact. Yes, but that's sort of what the square would have looked like. It functioned for sort of whatever it needed to. It was a place for celebration for holidays, military parades, and it also served as a more formal function for anytime there were proclamations, as well as a place for public executions. Yeah, exciting. So, the original plans by Terrazzini, the main architect for the city at the beginning, did intend for Trinity Square to remain the center of the city, but Peter then returned from his European tour in 17 and sort of looked at Trinity Square and decided that it had sort of developed much too haphazardly, because Trinity Square was unique because St. Petersburg is a meticulously planned city, but because Trinity Square had been catering to the needs at the very beginning, it had developed fairly organically. So Peter sort of looked at it and decided it was not organized, it was not European enough, and that to sort of recraft it the way he wanted it to be, he would have to start over completely. So at that point, the decision was made to move the center rather than try to rework Trinity. So.
All right. The Old Trinity Cathedral, or the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, was the first church built in the city of St. Petersburg, and up until the construction of St. Isaac's Cathedral was the dominant church, and following St. Isaac's, it became second in stature according to the the Russian Orthodox Church. The original cathedral was a simple, small wooden building that was replaced by the cathedral itself, which burned down in the mid-18th century and was reconstructed in neoclassical style. It continued operating until the 1930s, when, under Stalin's orders, the cathedral was destroyed. And following the end of the Soviet period, rather than rebuild the cathedral exactly, a chapel was built to commemorate the cathedral, which is what we see behind us on the southern end of Trinity Square. Other events that happened behind it is the Trinity Bridge, which nice music, which was commissioned, and a contest to determine the designer was held at the end of the 19th century. Okay. And construction, eventually the contest was won by a French architecture firm, and construction was completed in 1903, just in time for the anniversary of the city, which in attendance were both Nicholas and the French president, to commemorate the alliance between the two countries, and other similar events happened in other places in France. In January of 1905, the Bloody Sunday occurred, which occurred in various places throughout the city. Many groups gathered to approach the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar, who, unbeknownst to them, was not actually at the Winter Palace or even in the city at the time. One of the groups that gathered in Trinity Square in front of the cathedral and attempted to cross the newly constructed Trinity Bridge, and were stopped by police, who then fired upon them. And the estimates of the casualties are vary greatly depending on the reporting, from the Tsar's fairly low couple of hundred to the protesters claiming thousands. However, apparently Nicholas was quite moved and horrified by the events, or so he claims. I believe that's it, right? Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's everything.
Okay. So just to sort of wrap up, one thing that we sort of noticed as we were doing all the research for this is that Trinity Square was interestingly a place that sort of held on to a lot of constancy. You have the chapel, which was built to sort of maintain that. You have some of these incredibly old sort of foundational things. Peter's Cottage is nearby. It's this way. That was opened in 1930 as a museum. It was restored so that it looked as much like the actual cottage that Peter would have lived in as it can. So it was. It's an area that's very much connected to the foundations of the city, but it also was very much tied to revolution. We've talked about the Bloody Sunday. There's also a obelisk to commemorate the Decembrists in the vicinity should be
That way, I
this
think.
way.
Yeah,
We
by,
think.
That way.
behind the theater called
Yeah.
Fortress.
Okay.
Big thing.
And that
Yeah. And then under the Soviet government, the Trinity Square was actually renamed Revolution Square. And the Aurora, which is sort of a cruiser very much associated with revolution, it was involved in both the February and the October revolutions, is anchored nearby. And so it's just a very interesting place where constancy is kept, but this idea of revolution is also very much connected and a part of its history. So yeah, so that's Trinity as it's developed.